We have our full committee hearing this morning is an update on Afghanistan. We have two witnesses with us, Mr. David Helvey, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific region, and Brigadier General Matthew Trollinger, who is the Deputy Director for Political and Military Affairs on the Joint Staff. Once again, we are having a hybrid hearing, which means we have some members who will be participating remotely. And we have a fascinating little set of rules here that lays out how that works, which I read before each committee hearing. So here we go again. Members who are joining remotely must be visible on screen for the purposes of identity verification, establishing and maintaining a quorum, participating in the proceeding, and voting. Those members must continue to use the software platform's video function while in attendance, unless they experience connectivity issues or other technical problems that render them unable to participate on camera. If a member experiences technical difficulties, they should contact the committee staff for assistance. Video of members' participation will be broadcast in the room and via the television/internet feeds. Members participating remotely must seek recognition verbally, and they are asked to mute their microphones when they are not speaking. Members who are participating remotely are reminded to keep the software platform's video function on the entire time they attend the proceeding. Members may leave and rejoin the proceeding. If members depart for a short while for reasons other than joining a different proceeding, they should leave the video function on. If members will be absent for a significant period or depart to join a different proceeding, they should exit the software platform entirely and then rejoin it if they return. Members may use the software platform's chat feature to communicate with staff regarding technical or logistical support issues only. Finally, I have designated committee staff member to, if necessary, mute unrecognized members' microphones to cancel any inadvertent background noise that may disrupt the proceeding. Thank you. As mentioned, we are here today to discuss. I'm sorry, Mr. Lambert, you have a question.
Yeah, along those lines, Mr. Chairman, is it okay in committee if we follow, and I assume it is from your appearance, but we follow the rule that's now in effect in the chamber that we can have our mask off while we're speaking?
Yes, it does make it easier to understand, and the guidance now seems to be that that is within the reasonable risk area.
Good.
So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyway, we are back to talk about Afghanistan. Obviously, a lot can be said about the history, where we're at, but the main purpose of the hearing this morning, having heard the President's decision to pull out by early September from Afghanistan in coordination with our NATO allies, who will also be pulling their forces out, members are most interested in how that is going to happen. What is the process, and how are we working with our allies to carry out that, and then what is our strategy going forward? Because while we will not have a military presence in Afghanistan, Afghanistan in that region will still be of great concern to us in terms of national security and stability. So we're curious what the plans are in terms of how we meet that challenge in the environment going forward. And I think it also would be appropriate during this hearing to give some sort of lessons learned in terms of the last 20 years. It has without question been a difficult and controversial fight. I think it's important that we understand what we learned along the way, what went right, what went wrong, how we can avoid avoid might be an overly confident statement, how we can basically better deal with these challenges going forward. And I will say for the record that I support the President's decision. It is not an easy decision. It is not a win-win-win decision where everything is going to be fine. It was, I believe, merely the best decision out of a series of bad options. We have for 20 years tried to bring stability to Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, I, for one, never questioned what we were doing there. There were two very obvious things that we were doing there. One, we were trying to stop a transnational terrorist group from, again, being able to gain enough footing to attack us, as they did on 9/11 from Afghanistan, where they planned a good portion of the 9/11 attacks. They took advantage of ungoverned spaces. They took advantage of the Taliban giving them safe haven, and we all saw the terrible price that we paid for that. There is no question that working to try and prevent that from happening in the future made sense. And the second thing that we were trying to do there was out of the very logical assumption that if we had a stable government in Afghanistan, it would be less likely that those calamitous events that we all saw would happen again. So were there things we could do in working with the Afghan people and in working with the various interests in that region to achieve that? And that is what we've been attempting to do. It has proven to be beyond what we could, simply accomplish through sheer force of will, or certainly through our military. And I want to make perfectly clear that while I say that I support the President's decision, I do so in a very clear-eyed manner. Things are going to be bad in Afghanistan. There is no question about that. But one of the lessons that I hope we've learned is the limitations on our ability as a nation, and certainly as a military, to impose better outcomes on other countries. Afghanistan is not the only place in the world where horrible things are happening to the people who live there. Just off the top of my head, I think of Syria, Myanmar, Yemen, a number, Somalia, Libya, DRC. And could we, if we marshaled all of our resources as a country, used our military, go in there and conceivably make things better? Maybe. We don't have the breadth to do that, first of all. And second of all, I hope we've learned that even if we did, there are limitations on what an outside country can impose upon another country. There just are. A number of the Afghan people that don't support the Taliban probably are also troubled by our presence and by some of the impact of that presence. When you fight a war, you are not going to just hit the enemy. There will be civilian casualties no matter what. How much does that affect, make it more difficult to get a stable government in Afghanistan versus the benefit of us bringing greater security? I mean, that's a very difficult thing to balance out. But what I hope we've learned is that it is far, far more problematic than it may first appear. We cannot simply show up with a lot of might and a lot of money and a lot of goodwill and fix the problems that exist in the world. And there is an awful price to pay for us, and also in many cases for the country in question in trying. I hope we learn how to balance that as we go forward. But as I said at the outset, up front, what we want to hear is what's the plan going forward? How do we most safely get our troops out of Afghanistan, and how do we go forward in terms of dealing with the interests that we still have in the region? With that, I will yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's now been a month since President Biden announced that he was unconditionally withdrawing U.S. troops from Afghanistan by September the 11th. I believe it's the responsibility of this committee to examine the implications of President Biden's decision, both for our national security interest in the region and for our security interest here at home. I want to be crystal clear. I have significant concerns about President Biden's decision. Major questions remain about how we withdraw, what political arrangement is left following our departure. Since May 1st, Taliban has been crystal clear about their intentions. They've launched a new offensive targeting coalition forces, Afghan soldiers, and innocent civilians. On Saturday, the Taliban bombed a girls' school in Kabul, killing over 50 people, most of them young girls. Make no mistake, they will fight until they control that country again. And when they do, what assurance do we have it won't become a safe haven for terrorists again? We know that al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups remain present in Afghanistan and continue to have close ties with the Taliban, especially at the local level. The President assures us that he will maintain a, quote, over-the-horizon, close quote, capability to suppress threats, but to date hasn't explained what that means. There's no agreement in place with any of Afghanistan's neighbors to host coalition forces. So without any U.S. troops in the region, how will we gather intelligence and conduct the operations necessary to thwart these terrorist groups? We cannot afford to allow Afghanistan to have a blind spot again. There must be a detailed plan, and I expect the administration to explain to us before he completely withdraws from Afghanistan. Like every member of this committee, I want this war to end. I want to bring our troops home safely and as quickly as possible. But none of us want another 9/11. So we need to understand how the President plans to defeat these threats to our homeland before they reach our shores again. Mr. Helvey, I expect an explanation from you today of how the President intends to do just that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I was remiss in my remarks. It is worth pointing out that this is also the President Biden carrying out President Trump's plan. In fact, President Trump's plan was to have us out 2 weeks ago now, or a week and a half ago. So there's a bipartisan effort here as we look at where we are going forward, and there was a bipartisan decision between 2 presidents to reach the conclusion that we did. With that, I yield to Mr. Helvey for his opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Rogers, and members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide an update on the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces from Afghanistan. I appreciate your and this committee's continued interest in this matter. I want to begin this morning by condemning the deadly explosion that took place Saturday evening near a girls' high school in a predominantly Shia neighborhood in Kabul. While no group has claimed responsibility for the attack, it bears resemblance to past attacks by ISIS-K. This horrific event highlights the importance of our continued support to our Afghan partners as they combat terrorist threats across Afghanistan. Turning now to the President's decision. Following a rigorous review, the President determined that the best path forward to advance American interests is by ending the United States military involvement in the war in Afghanistan. Accordingly, and as directed by the President on April 14th, the Department began an orderly withdrawal of United States forces by May 1st and has plans to have all U.S. forces out of the country by September. This is the amount of time that we've determined will be necessary to bring our forces and those of our coalition partners home safely, and to retrograde, transfer, or dispose of responsibly equipment and other property. As part of the interagency review of United States policy in Afghanistan, the administration assessed that the threat from violent extremist organizations against the United States, now emanating from Afghanistan, can be addressed without a persistent United States military presence in that country. At the same time, we'll work closely with the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or ANDSF, and with our allies and our partners to maintain counterterrorism capabilities in the region sufficient to ensure that Afghanistan cannot again become a safe haven for terrorists who would threaten our security. In this context, and in coordination with our Afghan and international partners, we're working to reposition our counterterrorism capabilities, including by retaining assets in the region, to prevent the emergence of a terrorist threat against the United States homeland from Afghanistan, and to hold the Taliban to its commitments to ensure that al-Qaeda does not once again gain a foothold. And we will refine our counterterrorism strategy to monitor and disrupt terrorist threats to our homeland and our interests in a way that corresponds to the dispersed threat landscape that we face today. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank Congress and this committee specifically for its continued support for the Afghanistan Security Forces Fund, or ASFF. This is the mechanism through which the United States provides the majority of funding necessary to sustain the ANDSF in its combat operations, while developing the ANDSF into an effective and independent force capable of securing Afghanistan, protecting the Afghan people, and contributing to regional security. As Secretary Austin has said, we'll continue funding key capabilities such as Afghan Air Force and Special Mission Wing. We'll continue paying salaries for the Afghan security forces, and we'll continue delivering certain critical military supplies. Now, we're developing mechanisms to provide appropriate oversight for the use of these funds, most of which will continue to be executed through DoD contracts, and have engaged in discussions with congressional staff on how best to do this with efficiency and with accountability. Although we're withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan, we are standing squarely with our Afghan partners and redoubling our diplomatic efforts to achieve a lasting peace. Afghan forces are performing heroically against a relentless adversary. The Afghan army takes heavy losses daily, but they remain in the fight, and they're an institution of which the Afghan people can be proud. Mr. Chairman, the Department supports the ongoing diplomatic efforts to achieve a negotiated political settlement with the Afghan people, which the Afghan people themselves endorse. And we'll continue working with our colleagues at the State Department to ensure that we take care of those Afghans and their families who have helped us over the last 2 decades, most notably Afghan employees of the Department of Defense. And will provide sufficient support to the Department of State to maintain the important diplomatic mission that they will continue after the DoD departure. In closing, I want to thank again the members of this committee for your continued support to all those who have served in Afghanistan. I thank you for the opportunity to brief you this morning, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you. General, do you have an opening statement?
No, sir, I do not.
Okay, thank you. I think that the big question and I've heard, Mr. Rogers reference his comment is, what do we do now? And I think, the truth is there's no direct, easy answer, and it's hard to know, given that we have been postured in that region around having substantial forces in Afghanistan. That has been our primary plan to contain the terrorist threat there. So you can't really know for sure what's going to come next. It depends on negotiations with the neighbors. It depends on how a lot of things play out. But the amount of guidance that you could give us on sort of what your vision is for containing that terrorist threat once we are out, I think is the big questions on people's minds. Now, I will point out that there's terrorist threats all over the place, and most of the intel experts that I talk to now say that the primary transnational terrorist threats are coming now from the Middle East and Africa. So we've got resources dedicated to dealing with that there. Just because there's a small threat doesn't mean that we have to have a massive response to it. But even within that context, Mr. Helvey, what is your vision right now for what transnational terrorist containment looks like in South Asia post-September when our troops are out?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. In the first instance, I would say that the priority that we're placing right now is how to manage the drawdown and the retrograde in a safe and orderly way. And so we're continuing to do the detailed planning there.
Sorry, I understand that. That's not my question. Others can ask about that if they want. My question is, once we're gone, what is the vision for how we contain the terrorist threat in South Asia?
In response to your direct question, then, Mr. Chairman, I think the best way to think about it is to consider how we manage that based on three concentric circles. In the most innermost ring is what we have in Afghanistan and the work that we would continue to do through a diplomatic presence with our Afghan partners. To be able to help to manage and mitigate the threat of terrorism that can emanate from Afghanistan. So there is a function of continuing to work with a willing and capable partner in Afghanistan. And that'll remain a major part of our effort there and our focus. The second ring deals with how we address it, with a regional military presence. We have substantial capability in the Middle East, in the Gulf, and those capabilities are not abating. We'll still have the ability to prosecute terrorism from positions around the region. We do have to look at areas that are closer into Afghanistan, and those are negotiations and discussions that are ongoing. I'd be reluctant to get into details in terms of where and who in an open session, but looking at what that footprint is going to be like within the region is going to be an important part of the equation. And then the third ring is globally and how we manage transnational threats globally. And I would offer that we've learned a lot over the past 20 years in how to address transnational terrorist threats. And we've developed means across the government and as a nation and with our allies and our partners to cooperatively address and mitigate and reduce the danger of terrorist threats against the United States. I mean, you know that every time you take a commercial flight or open a bank account, there's lots of things that we've been able to do across the government to better understand, characterize, and prosecute those terrorist threats. And so those three rings have to be working in concert in a coordinated way, but that's how we look to address the terrorist threats.
Thank you. And I just, three final comments before I turn it over to Mr. Rogers. Number one, that was a really good answer. We need to hear that more, because I think a lot of members are a little puzzled in terms of, what's the plan? There is, in fact, a plan. There are some things that we can do. It's good to hear that. Second, on the classified thing, I should have mentioned this up front. At 2 o'clock in the CVC, we'll be continuing this hearing in a classified setting so we can get into those other details. And the last thing, and no need to comment on this, but it is really important that the DOD support expansion of the special immigrant visas for our partners in Afghanistan who want to come back to this country. We are way under, well, what's the word I'm looking for here? We have more people who want them than we have them for. And I more than anybody, am aware of the difficulties of finding the mandatory money and how that works, but I think it is an obligation that we should make sure that we uphold and find ways to expand that program. And that's just, like I said, no comment necessary. I just wanted to put that plug out there. And Mr. Rogers is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chairman was correct earlier when he made the point that the Biden administration's policy to withdraw from Afghanistan is following up on the previous administration. The big difference is the previous administration's was conditions-based. This is unconditional withdrawal, which brings me to the Taliban in Afghanistan. General, the Taliban has a history of not being trustworthy in their negotiations to meet the conditions for us to withdraw. Do you trust the Taliban to adhere to any of the commitments they're making now to get us to withdraw?
Sir, I don't want to get into hypotheticals in terms of.
We're having a hard time hearing you there. Could you pull the microphone like in front of your face there?
There you go.
Good. You hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to get into hypotheticals on what may or may not transpire over the next several months as we continue to pursue a successful.
Not my
peace
question.
process here.
Do you trust the Taliban to adhere to any agreement? Just a yes or no.
I think the Taliban is capable of adhering to agreements. If they choose to, they're capable of doing just that.
Okay. Let me ask this, and I want to follow up with Mr. Helvey. You heard my opening statement. We made reference to the president saying that we were going to have over-the-horizon capabilities. I don't know what that means. I want specificity about basing in the region. I can't imagine Russia and China allowing any of the stands to have U.S. base capability in that region. Why would we leave Bagram when we don't have an alternative closer than the UAE? So give me specifically, what does over-the-horizon capabilities mean with regard to basing so we can conduct ISR?
Well, sir, you know, as indicated to the chairman, there are some details which I think are best left in a classified session. But for the purposes,
Are we going to have a classified session, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, I made that announcement a minute ago, 2 o'clock.
I'm sorry. Okay, good.
for the purposes of an open session, I think it's important to say that we do want to maintain a regional counterterrorism capacity. And as I indicated, we do have significant capabilities resident within the Middle East, within the Persian Gulf region. But we want to explore those options, and we are doing so, to be able to maintain both military and intelligence assets in the region. So that we're going to be in a position to identify threats as they emerge and prosecute those. We have to maintain what's called access, basing, and overflight, and those are the discussions that we're having. And it is a very difficult neighborhood, sir, as you pointed out, which is why we want to be able to work very carefully, quietly, but efficiently with our partners to make sure that we have the types of capabilities that are there to address the threats that we and our allies and our partners may face from transnational terrorist groups.
Okay, is it your intent that this withdrawal will not be completed until those plans are nailed down for basing?
It is our intent to work swiftly along both lines of effort to ensure that we have a safe, orderly, and responsible withdrawal, and at the same time working very closely with our intelligence and State Department colleagues and partners to ensure that we have the arrangements in place to address the terrorist threats that may emerge in the future from Afghanistan. But
As a recovering attorney, that was very lawyerly. I'm looking for we don't intend to leave until we got a base.
The two planning efforts are in parallel, but they're not linked.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Langeman is recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, sorry. I always like to point out before I ask questions. If we get down to the end, 5 minutes is 5 minutes. So if you're answering the question, please try to wrap up at the 5-minute point, or I will have to interrupt you to move on to the next questioner. So thank you. With that, Mr. Langeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Helvey, thank you for your testimony. To begin with, the chairman may very well be right that this is the statement he said this is maybe the best of a lot of bad options. I guess we won't know that perhaps for several years. But I have a couple comments before I get to questions. I have to say for the record that I do have concerns about how this withdrawal decision was made, and I'm very worried about al-Qaeda reconstituting and how the Taliban treat women and minorities. And this administration is also required to communicate with Congress before withdrawing, and quite frankly, we have not received a satisfactory report on the situation. So with that, Mr. Helvey, the Afghan study group recently said that terrorist groups could reconstitute in 18 to 36 months after our withdrawal. That is, of course, during President Biden's first term. If that happened and the Afghan National Government asked us for help, what would we do? How do we plan on handling that? Your microphone.
I'm sorry. Well, sir, I'd be reluctant to get into a hypothetical, like if, what we would do in those circumstances. But what I can say is what we're planning for. We do have a bilateral security agreement with Afghanistan, with the Afghan government, and that does not change. So we will continue working with our Afghan partners to be able to address terrorist threats as they emerge, and to be able to, if needed, to defeat those terrorist threats before they can levy an attack against the United States or our allies or our interests. So that is the plan, and that's what we're working to be able to accomplish. But I can't get into specifics about what the president may or may not do at some point in the future.
Yeah. I understand not wanting to answer hypotheticals. This is certainly within the realm of likelihood. And so I would hope that at least now, and can you tell me, have you been at least wargaming this out, planning it out so that you have a range of options to choose from, and you would know which one to choose, which is going to be best given the situation, at least?
We're planning for all options, and the intent would be to be in a position to make recommendations to the Secretary and to the President on how to prosecute threats to the United States.
Mr. Helvey, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction Fund found significant corruption brought on by our security and development aid. The President has said that we aren't going to stop or reduce our foreign aid. So to what extent has our billions of dollars in aid, much of which fell into the hands of warlords and criminals, threatened Afghan stability and delegitimized the government that we're trying to work with? And if the Taliban strengthen or form a power-sharing government with the national government, will they become formally involved in distributing U.S. aid? And have we thought about the implications of that?
Well, sir, I think as you've highlighted, there has been a long history of our engagement in Afghanistan, and we have learned lessons as we've gone. So we've tried to develop the means to be able to more effectively deliver that aid and to be able to do it reliably with the types of controls and oversight that's necessary to ensure that the resources go to the people that it's intended to go to, and it serves as a stabilizing effect in the country by having a willing and capable partner. Understanding your question on what happens in the future, if the Taliban were to join a power-sharing arrangement, and it's a if, we would have to look at how we would be able to accomplish continued delivery of that type of assistance to the ANDSF, and make sure that Congress continues to be comfortable with the oversight mechanisms and we're in full compliance with the law.
That's going to be critically important going forward. We're already concerned about the amount of fraud and waste that has occurred as a result of corruption. We need to double down if we're not going to have a military presence there, especially to make sure that those aid dollars are going where they're intended and not be diverted for corrupt purposes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson is recognized for 5 minutes. You with us there, Joe?
Hey, I sure am. Hey, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses being here today. Mr. Helvey, what is the role of the department in the intra-Afghan negotiations, considering that the Taliban are fanatical totalitarians? There is significant concern that the societal gains made in the last 20 years may be undone. What can the department do to ensure these gains remain, especially as girls and women are being targeted?
Well, sir, the role of the Department of Defense in the negotiations has been to play a supporting role. We've supported our State Department colleagues under Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad's lead as the Special Representative for Afghan Reconciliation. And our role has been to support his efforts and to support the Afghan government's efforts by providing support and assistance to them as they are trying to provide for security in the country. In terms of how to be able to preserve those gains, we do wish to see those gains preserved. They've been difficult to come by and hard fought and hard won. And indeed, Afghanistan has made significant progress in advancing human rights and opportunities, in particular for women and girls, over the past 20 years. The courage and enduring importance of Afghan women and their contributions to progress in society are remarkable and apparent. I think it's important that we make clear and continue to make clear that the protection of these gains over the past 20 years is going to be a critical metric for Afghanistan's future acceptance by the international community. Our international partners are also very much committed to that effort. We need to remain aware that our departure does create new risks for human rights in general in Afghanistan, and that's something that we are cognizant of and attentive to. But part of the effort is to make sure that we can hold the Afghan Taliban to account to the extent possible. And part of that is by the legitimacy that they
again,
crave.
thank you.
Sorry.
Hey, again, I appreciate very much, but I'm very concerned. The progress that Americans have made and our allies to really help the people of Afghanistan. Thank you for citing that. And General, have there been any direct attacks by Taliban on U.S. forces since May 1st of 2021? And what about on the Afghan people? And of course, with the heinous murder of dozens of girls in Kabul over the weekend, how do you differentiate murder by the Taliban, murder by ISIS, murder by Al-Qaeda? And I sincerely believe that we should defeat the terrorists overseas, or they will again commit mass murder of American families. I appreciate that Chairman Mike McCall and Ambassador Ryan Crocker were correct in their op-ed in the New York Times on May the 4th. And so back again, have there been any attacks since May the 1st?
Sir, there have not been any attacks by the Taliban against U.S. or coalition forces since May the 1st.
And General, in regard to that, how in the world do you differentiate Taliban, ISIS, Al-Qaeda? It's inconceivable. The attack on girls at the girls' school over the weekend, the dozens that were slaughtered. There's got to be a way that, bottom line is that I'm really concerned that we're turning the country over to people who have every intent to develop an ability to come back and attack the United States. Another concern I have, and this would be, General, the terrorism threat will not end with the withdrawal, and I'm concerned that we're leaving ourselves with no infrastructure or counterterrorism abilities. And we should never forget that the murderous attacks of September the 11th, 2001, of innocent Americans were conducted by a cave in Afghanistan. How do we stop this? How do we protect the American people, General?
Well, as Mr. Helvey indicated, we are in the midst of continuous planning, prudent planning, to get after how best to make a seamless transition for the capabilities that we have currently in Afghanistan that will come out of Afghanistan. But where best to position those so that we can address our overarching objectives in preventing Afghanistan from being a safe haven for terrorists.
Well, General, again, I have faith in you, and I'm really grateful that my youngest son served for a year as an engineer in Afghanistan, and I appreciate his service in the South Carolina Army National Guard. Served there for a year, the 218th Brigade. We want the best for the people of Afghanistan to protect American families at home. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to yield my time to Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Larson and Mr. Chairman. Mr. Helvey, General Trollinger, thank you for the testimony today. As an Army Ranger and as a paratrooper, I served both in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both places, I worked very closely with local Iraqis and Afghani interpreters, contractors, and others, without whom I may not be here today, and without whom we could not have accomplished our mission and done our work. I'm going to tell the story very briefly about a man named Mohammed, who spent the last 12 years helping U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Mohammed had applied for a special immigrant visa in 2010. He was denied repeatedly, delays stopped the visa from being processed. In January 27th of this year, Mohammed was driving to work with his 10-year-old son when a Taliban vehicle stopped in front of him. Assassins jumped out and gunned him down in front of his son. All the while, those assassins yelled out, quote, "Where are the American forces to save you? Where are their helicopters? Where are their airplanes? You helped them for a decade. Where are they now?" End quote. Mohammed is dead. A couple of weeks later, his oldest son received this death threat from the Taliban. He and many others like him will soon die unless we act. General McKenzie recently said that if directed to do so, the Department of Defense could successfully conduct an evacuation of at-risk populations out of the country. Mr. Helvey, do you agree with this assessment?
If directed to do so, we could.
Who is the interagency lead for this issue, Mr. Helvey?
We are working with the through the interagency process to look at the different options. There are different authorities, as you know, to address this.
Is there an interagency lead, Mr. Helvey?
I would believe State Department would be the lead.
Do you believe or do you know?
I believe that State Department would be the lead for this.
You don't know for sure.
I do not know for sure. It depends on what we're talking about. If we're
Mr. Helvey, we're several weeks into this drawdown. We have no time left. There are lives of Afghanistan's, our partners, people that we have an obligation to, not just a moral obligation, but a national security obligation. And you don't know who the interagency lead is.
For the Special Immigrant Visa Program, the State Department's the lead, although, as you know, a lot of times the quotas are addressed through the National Defense Authorization Act. The mechanisms by which those Afghans could depart could depend on the different circumstances, but State Department is the lead for the SIV.
Mr. Helvey, would the establishment of an interagency task force help expedite this process?
I believe it would, and we are working with the National Security Council to work through these issues, having, interagency meetings multiple times a week to address this specific question.
And what does DOD need from Congress to help those over 18,000 Afghans who have applied for a special immigrant visa who are waiting on us right now?
One of the things we would like to work in, and I do support the chairman's suggestion of increasing resources for the special immigrant visa program. If I know that this is a very time-intensive effort, but certainly increasing the quotas would be a tremendous help in making sure we got the resources.
Thank you, Mr. Helvey. I would like to yield the rest of my time to Ms. Slotkin.
So I just want to pick up a conversation that I was having with the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense when they came and briefed us on the plan. I don't think there's a ton of debate on generally wanting to get out of Afghanistan between Democrats, Republicans, between American citizens. But the question is, how do we know if something has been tripped that should require us to go back if, for instance, there is another attack being planned, if there was the full collapse of the state? So what are the tripwires the Department of Defense has that you will provide to the White House and others to identify whether we're creeping back into that dangerous state?
Well, I think the key thing is to have persistent intelligence to be able to understand how the security situation in Afghanistan is evolving and how terrorist threats are beginning to reemerge.
I will just say from my experience working on ISIS and the fact that we did have some intelligence that ISIS was taking over major swaths of the country, but because we as an interagency didn't have clear tripwires that sort of went red when we crossed over those in places like in Iraq and Syria, we weren't able to muster the interagency energy to go back in for quite some time. So I would just encourage at the end of my time here some very specific tripwires that we evaluate here as a committee. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Mr. Turner is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I feel sorry for you today. And I feel sorry for you because you're being asked very specific questions about how you're going to do things that you've described to us that you're going to do from an audience that's incredibly skeptical, that doesn't believe that you can do them. Because generally, it's pretty well known that you're not going to be able to fight the counterterrorism mission because of just a basic logistics after leaving Afghanistan. That the Taliban have not agreed in any binding way not to overthrow the Afghan government. And the Afghan national forces are very compromised and are going to find it very difficult to try to hold Afghan territory. And which takes me to follow on with Representative Slotkin's question, where she was asking for tripwires. What I'm going to ask you is, since you are planning, and since just about everybody on this committee believes you're going to have to go back in because of the hasty withdrawal that is occurring, not just what tripwires are you doing, but also what planning are you doing? We're leaving infrastructure, we're leaving facilities. Excuse me. To what extent are you working with the Afghan national government to work on facility logistical planning to accommodate instances where you do have to go back? Either of you?
As indicated, sir, we are doing detailed planning for all outcomes and options. As we are conducting the retrograde and withdrawal, we are turning over facilities to our Afghan partners. We're also looking to continue providing the support and assistance to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces so that we do indeed retain a willing and capable partner. I think that is going to be one of the essential elements in how we'll be able to continue monitoring and prosecuting terrorists.
Willing and capable partner for your need, because you mentioned that there's a bilateral agreement between the United States and Afghanistan, willing and able to partner for you to be able to return, go back in with operations, and hopefully come back out.
I want to.
That's my question, return.
I want to be clear that whether or not we return is a decision that the president would.
Oh, I understand that. My question to you, though, is what I'm planning, which is what your presentation is supposed to be about. To what extent are you, with these facilities and with the Afghan partners, working on the issue of logistics so that on the need that, due to those bilateral agreements you cited, that you have to go back in to assist, that the facilities can accommodate your return and your operations?
We're working all those options.
Great. So it's on your to-do list.
It is on the to-do list.
Great. Wonderful. Next question. One of the concerns that people have is the fact that the exit, although as I described it as hasty, is ongoing with the U.S. It is also ongoing with our partners, especially our NATO partners. Since they have critical functions upon their exit, they could diminish the overall security situation for either U.S. personnel or other allied personnel. To what extent are you coordinating the operations of our allies as it relates to the security as people are exiting?
We are coordinating intensively and closely with our allies and coalition partners to facilitate the withdrawal. That is absolutely something that
coordination's easier to say than to do. You know, there are a number of people who believe that there's concern that there are even coalition partners that are leaving that have critical functions for which there is no one who's backfilling. You are aware that there are those concerns, are you not? We
are aware of those concerns, and part of our task is to ensure that we can ensure that there's A, no gaps, and B, that we can help facilitate a coordinated withdrawal of U.S. and allied forces. As we say with our NATO partners, we went in together, we'll adjust together, and we'll depart together.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, again, want to echo my support for your comments regarding the special immigrant visa program, as well as Mr. Crow. I think, again, if it requires our committee to move with some type of enabling legislation, maybe ahead of NDAA, I think, frankly, that's our responsibility.
And I'm sorry, if I can explain that. If we pause the gentleman's time here for a second, and I should have explained this more clearly. The special immigrant visa program requires mandatory spending, and this is the fight we have every year. And the rules, as they're written, require us to, you have to find we have to cut something else in order to fund mandatory spending, okay? So every visa costs a certain amount of money, and every year we go searching for mandatory money. Mandatory money is not easy to find. Mandatory money, it's complicated, but it's not, you can't just cut a plane, whatever. Now, it is an option, and an option that I think we need to consider, that we can just waive that requirement and we can just spend the money. And we have done that over the course of the last few years to the tune of billions of dollars, including on Mr. Wilson's widow's tax, as they called it. And if I'm being perfectly honest with you, to get to the numbers that we all want to get to, which is I think there's 18,000 pending at the moment, and we only have authorization, I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, for like 7,000 maybe. If we're going to get there, we are going to have to waive that requirement. We are not going to find the money to accommodate all of the special immigrant visas that are needed. I would bet on that. Maybe I'll be proven wrong. So if we're really dedicated and committed to doing that, that is what we, on a bipartisan basis, are going to have to do. So, apologize, but I wanted to make sure that was clear.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I think, frankly, it's kind of our marching orders. I would take it that way. So, so again, I'd like to spend a few minutes, though, Mr. Helvey, just talking about the exit, okay? Because I think it's important to remember that the agreement with the Taliban that this government executed in February of 2020, we had a troop level at that point of about 15,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. By the time the president was sworn into office in January, the exit had already been underway. I mean, the troop levels were about 2,500 in January. I mean, is that correct? I just want to make sure, you know, we have a little more context here in terms of the withdrawal.
That is correct.
So in terms of the review that was conducted, you know, by the Defense Department and the State Department, you know, I guess and part of the agreement, by the way, in February was that during this withdrawal period, the Taliban agreed to not attack U.S. troops. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And again, I mean, it wasn't maybe squeaky clean perfect, but certainly the casualty rates were significantly stable during that time period. If the president had made the choice to say, well, you know what, we're gonna, you know, set aside the agreement or you know, make a different decision, 2,500 troops at you know, this past month. I mean, there would have had to been, I think, actually a need to bring more troops in if we were going to basically say the agreement has been breached and you know, whatever terms of non-aggression or non-attacks would also be set aside as well, right? I mean, the troop level at 2,500 is not sufficient to, you know, carry out a mission against the Taliban, which would have been effective. I mean, I think that's almost common sense, isn't it?
Well, sir, I think that at the 2,500 troop level, on the advice of the commanders, we had a capability, a very lethal capability to protect the force, to continue providing our support to our Afghan national defense and security forces partners, and also to work in concert with our NATO partners who had a greater military presence than the U.S. On its own to be able to execute the missions that we had in Afghanistan, which was counterterrorism and train, advise, and assist of our Afghan partners. That was a capability that we had at 2,500.
But certainly, you know, the context of the agreement, which was that the Taliban would agree to lay off U.S. troops from February 2020, you know, up until 2021. I mean, if we had set aside the agreement, that environment would have changed. I mean, it just seems like you can't have it both ways if we, you know, decided to keep troops there and expect compliance with that provision of the prior agreement regarding non-aggression against U.S. troops.
In response to your question, we would assume that if we backed out of the agreement, then yes, the Taliban would not be obligated to comply with its terms of the agreement, which was to not attack U.S. or coalition forces, which they did not.
Right. So regarding, you know, just continuing support for the Afghan military, again, you mentioned in your testimony the Afghan Security Forces Fund, which again, looking at last year's OCO account, that was about $4 billion that was appropriated for that account. Is that correct?
About 3.8. But yes.
And so do you see that sort of same level of funding moving forward?
We're going to require significant funds, going forward to continue supporting the ANDSF. I think this year it might be a little bit less, but yes, keeping the funding for our partners, in particular for salaries, supplies, and support to the Afghan Air Force and Special Mission Wing, is going to be critical, and that's what the ASIF accomplishes.
So, and again, while we're on the subject of the OCO, I mean, again, the funding, the direct funding for U.S. forces in Afghanistan, presumably, will no longer be required. That was at about $14 billion in last year's OCO. Is that correct?
I don't have the specifics in front of me, sir.
Okay. Again, that's the CRS report, which was that was the number that was allocated. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize the point that Mr. Courtney made. The Taliban agreed not to attack us. If they, on May 1st, if we said, you know what, we're not going to abide by the agreement, we're sticking around, I don't think there's anyone in this committee who would believe that the Taliban would not have started attacking us in that point. And I don't think there's anyone in the military who believes that our forces, as they're currently structured, as they were structured over the course of the last year to deal with an environment where the Taliban were not attacking us, that when they decided to attack us, that force structure was going to work. Nobody can possibly believe that. And I just want to make sure members of the committee understand that's the choice. I would love to have an option where we protect all the Afghan people, and it works. Love to have that option. But the option we have is to send more U.S. and coalition troops to Afghanistan to once again full-scale fight the Taliban. So I'm very concerned about what's going to happen to the Afghan people. But we as members of this committee have to understand that if the president had made that different decision, our constituents would once again be dying in Afghanistan. Members who are serving in the military right now would be asked to go back over there, and their families would have to realize that there would be dead and injured coming back. And then could we tell those people, yeah, but a year from now it's going to be better. 2 years from now it's going to be better. 5 years from now it's going to be better. Your sacrifice will make a difference. Could we tell them that? I could not. You cannot tell me that after 20 years that doing the same thing for another 1, 2, 5, or 10 would have changed that. So we would have been asking people to die to not accomplish anything. That's a really tough thing to do. As I said, there's no easy answer here. But let's not pretend that there's some magical choice whereby we protect everyone in Afghanistan and it doesn't cost us dearly. That's what I hope members will think about as we go through this. Mr. Lamburn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I understand what you are just saying, but I hope that the result of all this, especially the way it's being done in a hasty manner, doesn't lead anyone who sacrificed life and limb and their surviving families to think that it was in vain. I hope that that is not the result of the outcome of this. I'm concerned about the geopolitical aspects, but my biggest concern is for those who sacrificed so much. And I'm concerned that we might be going in that direction. Mr. Helvey, I know we're going to talk more at 2 o'clock in the classified session about agreements for over-the-horizon options. And the ranking member was asking about that. I, too, have huge questions over what that looks like. Afghanistan is a landlocked country, 300 miles from the Arabian Sea. It would require overflights if you have a sea-based over-the-horizon option over Iran or Pakistan. The first is impossible, and the second is problematic. There are 7 or 8 countries that border Afghanistan. I'll get to the dispute here in a second, but one of those is Iran, one of those is China. I don't think any agreements with those 2 countries are going to be forthcoming. There's a disputed border with India claiming it and Pakistan denying it to Afghanistan, but I don't know if we have an agreement with India in any case for basing in that part of proximity to Afghanistan. And then that leaves Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. So of all those countries, and I'm not asking you to divulge anything classified, but as of today, is there any agreement with any of those 7 or 8 countries for basing that we have that would give us an over-the-horizon option?
We do not have an agreement with any of those countries. But as I indicated in my response to a previous question, we are working all the different options that we have in concert with our State Department intelligence community colleagues to establish the types of arrangements that give us the access, basing, and overflight necessary to address the terrorism threats.
And Mr. Crow was referring to the horrific killing of a loyal translator that was serving the U.S. Interests, and we were there and weren't able to stop it. How, being hundreds of miles away at best, are we going to be able to stop so many things that could happen in a bloodbath scenario?
If I could answer just with two statements. One, we do have a special responsibility to support and protect those that supported and protected us for these past 20 years. And we need to work with our interagency colleagues and with the Congress to make sure that we have the resources and the capabilities to do just that. I think the second part of it, and a larger part of it, is that the best way to provide for security and stability for the Afghan people is to see a negotiated peace agreement between the warring sides. And we will continue to support the effort for the Afghan people themselves to sit and determine their own fate, determine their own future.
Now, along that line, the ranking member asked General Trollinger if the Taliban have entered into any agreements, and I believe his answer was they are capable of entering into an agreement. But I think we have to admit, though they might be capable, they haven't yet done so in a way that, not just for American forces, but for a comprehensive settlement, would hold water. Isn't that true?
They've started inter-Afghan negotiations, but there has not been a political settlement that's emerged from it.
And I guess my last question is, and I think it was unfortunate to choose 9/11 as the withdrawal date. Won't the Taliban just declare victory? Whether it's true or not, or justified or not, aren't they going to declare victory on 9/11?
I'll leave it to the Taliban to decide what they want to say and how they want to do it. Our job is to provide for a safe, orderly, and responsible withdrawal of our forces consistent with the direction that the President has given us.
I agree we don't want to speak and can't speak for them, but I don't want to give them an opportunity for an unforced error on our part. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Spear is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our presenters today. I just want to associate myself with all the comments made by my colleagues about protecting those who have been there protecting us. And I fear that the NDA is too late. If we have to wait for the NDAA to provide the funding, that we will have jeopardized many lives. I'm curious, Mr. Chairman, if temporary protective status would allow us to bring these individuals to the United States without the mandatory spending. If you could answer that. Do you know the answer to that?
That's an immigration thing. I'm pretty sure you're correct. I don't know the ins and outs of the temporary protective status rules, but we will explore that as an option. In our bailiwick, the special immigrant visa program is what we have. So we will explore other options as well.
Thank you. General Trollinger, what is the value of the equipment and weapons we have in Afghanistan right now?
Ma'am, I don't have a specific number for you at this time.
Could you provide that to the committee?
Yes, ma'am, I will.
And what is your intentions about destroying weapons, equipment, and facilities?
As part of our safe, orderly, and coordinated withdrawal from Afghanistan, we will be retrograding people, equipment, and turning over to JAROA specific equipment. And then we will also be turning over to Defense Logistics Agency specific equipment that will need to be destroyed.
All right, you will give us a list of that as well.
Yes, ma'am.
What kind of military presence is necessary to protect our diplomatic and technical assistance mission in Afghanistan after withdrawal?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What kind of military presence is necessary to protect our diplomatic and technical assistance mission in Afghanistan after withdrawal, presuming that we still have an embassy there?
Assuming that we maintain a diplomatic presence, we can expect to see a military presence that will provide an adequate security apparatus to protect the diplomatic mission. That planning is ongoing at this time, but there's been no decision made on what that would look like.
All right. You know, we have kept our part of this peace agreement that was created by then President Trump, who always criticized a date certain for somehow telegraphing what our steps would be. But Taliban has not kept its part of the deal. How can the Department of Defense and the State Department bring pressure to bear to ensure that the Taliban meets its obligations under the agreement?
Ma'am, I think that we can address that in a number of different ways. First, as I indicated, we will maintain the capability to provide for defense of our forces as we conduct the retrograde, and to be able to hold the Taliban accountable for its commitments to end its support to Al-Qaeda. So that is not going away. I mean, we're looking at what the specifics in terms of an over-the-horizon presence will be, but that's the president's intent, is to maintain the capability to do that, to defend American interests and those of our allies. So that is something that we have a lethal force in the region. We have a capable force in the region to accomplish that. I think a second part of it kind of extends beyond the military realm, and that is the Taliban's own desire for international recognition and a sense of legitimacy, and to provide additional assistance to the country in the future. And so that part of it is also the pressure.
Okay, thank you. I have one last question for General Trollinger. You indicated that ISIS was responsible for this heinous crime this weekend where over 80 people died at the school. How do you know that? And how do we not know that ISIS is now a proxy for the Taliban?
Ma'am, I did not indicate that they were responsible for that.
I thought I heard that in your testimony.
No, ma'am.
If not, I stand corrected.
No, ma'am.
All right, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Could you clarify that point, Mr. Helvey?
I said in my opening statement that no party has claimed responsibility for the attack. However, it bears a resemblance to the types of attacks that we've seen previously from ISIS-K.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Whitman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Helvey, I want to go to you. I believe that we're really in the catch-22 situation in Afghanistan with what we see before us. Economists would call it a death spiral. Here we are having to provide continual military and financial support to the government of Kabul. When we do that, it undermines their legitimacy with the Afghan people. So in order to shore them up, we provide more resources, more military support, further weakening their standing with the Afghan people. As you can see, it goes back and forth, back and forth. We saw exactly the same thing transpire in Vietnam. We also see ourselves in a position where there is not the will to decisively and forcefully eradicate the Taliban. It's just not there. I've been there multiple times. I understand, we try to straddle that element of getting Afghan to a point where it can self-sustain, both economically, from a governance standpoint. It's been extraordinarily difficult, if not on the verge of impossible. Let me ask this. In a scenario that we would continue to support the government in Kabul, would anything be different in 5 years or in 10 years? And where would the Afghan government be under those situations let's say, in the long term? Could they sustain? Where would it be? So to look at the other scenario, now that we're getting out, look at the other scenario. If we continue that, would anything be different?
Well, sir, I think from a Department of Defense perspective, right? I think the best thing, the best outcome would be a peaceful settlement between the warring parties in Afghanistan. That is the mechanism, that would be the mechanism by which the security situation would improve. That would be the mechanism by which the economy would be able to continue growing, and that would also be the mechanism by which we could have even greater confidence that Afghanistan would not again become a safe haven for terrorists who would attack us or our allies or our partners. So that's the focus, and that is what we will continue to support and continue to encourage. Now, in terms of the role that our assistance provides, I would say that the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces have improved. They are the ones that are doing the bulk of the fighting. They're also the ones that are doing the bulk of the dying in Afghanistan. And in particular, the improvements that we've been able to see in the Afghan Air Forces and Special Mission Wing, I think, are significant and noteworthy. And that's been a direct result of the assistance that we've provided. And that would be one of those areas, not the exclusive one, but one of those areas that we would look to continue providing our Afghan partners through this process and after our withdrawal.
So as we continue on in that effort and we're providing some level of counterterrorism mission there in Afghanistan, and we're going to be at long distances, so it's going to be difficult to respond in ways that would be of immediate support to Afghan forces there or to immediately respond to those particular issues. To me, it points to the things that we've seen that are weaknesses throughout the year. There are certain things, you're right, that the Afghan armed forces can do. There are other things that they really can't do or don't do that well. One of the things we know that is critical in their battle against the Taliban or other destabilizing forces that try to insert themselves into Afghanistan is the element of air support and being able to support their forces on the ground. Do the Afghan armed forces know that as we pull out and as we move out at longer distances away, that there's not going to be that air support there, that they're going to be saddled with providing that close air support? Are they aware of that? And how do you see them faring? And you talk about, yeah, they're doing well, but I think they're only doing well in certain areas. So what happens when we have that subtraction of our support there in what the Afghan armed forces can do?
We'll continue providing the support to the extent that we can and to do so safely. The Afghan Air Force is one of those areas that has improved considerably, and we'll
can they be an effective fighting force with the current air opportunities that they have?
I'd have to defer to my Joint Staff colleague for a military assessment of their capability, but
General Trollinger, you have 10 seconds.
They are absolutely a capable fighting force.
And do they have capable air support?
They do currently have capable air support.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Moulton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you. Go ahead.
It's clear that we will not win the war in Afghanistan, but there are still many disastrous ways that we can lose. Terrorists can come back. Girls can be banned from school. We may not have the bases that we need to prosecute affairs in the region. The Trump administration set us on a withdrawal timeline for this month, and it's clear from the testimony this morning that they laid out no clear plans for how that would actually be accomplished. But irrespective of the Trump administration's failures, this responsibility is now squarely on the shoulders of the Biden administration. Can you tell us, Mr. Helvey, how your scenario planning is going as you conduct war games for how this will be carried out in the mere 122 days that you have between now and September 11th, are you gaining more confidence in the plan, or are these war games exposing additional concerns that you'll have to address?
Sir, I think you could answer it with saying both. I mean, the more planning we do, the more assessment we do, the more confidence we can have in our plan. At the same time, part of the point of doing assessment and planning is to identify potential blind spots, potential vulnerabilities, so that we can work to put in the mitigations to address those and close those. So we are doing those detailed plans. We have more work to do, and that's what the Department of Defense does, and that's what we do extremely well. So again, perhaps a long-winded answer to a short question, but yes, we're both gaining confidence and identifying areas where we can improve as we go forward.
In your judgment, do we have enough time? I've served in the Department of Defense, but at a much lower level than you. But as a Marine commander on the ground in Iraq, I certainly learned that you don't want to go into an operation without a plan. And if it looks like your plan is not going to work, then you explore options to take more time to get it right before you conduct an operation. Do you think we're going to find ourselves in that scenario?
Well, sir, the planning did not begin on April 14th. We've been conducting planning for this circumstance for some time prior to that. I think it had been previously raised in a previous question. With the signing of the U.S. Taliban peace agreement last February, the planning for the withdrawal began, and that is something that we have been working very closely with our Joint Staff colleagues, our U.S. CENTCOM colleagues, and our Resolute Support Operation Freedom Sentinel colleagues on how to do that.
If I may interrupt, Mr. Helvey, if I may interrupt, my question is, are you prepared to extend the timeline if the planning exposes vulnerabilities that cannot be addressed by September 11th?
I think we're looking at a lot of different options on how we can do that. But I wouldn't be in a position today to tell you what those options, how those options may interface with a timeline for withdrawing. I mean, the President's direction to the department has been clear, and we're developing plans to be able to meet his intent, to do so safely, orderly, and responsibly.
My colleague, Ms. Locken, from her experience in DOD, talked about the importance of having trip lines that will identify when we need to take action to, God forbid, have to go back into Afghanistan, which I think would be the worst result. Look, I want to bring the troops home as much as anyone, but the worst thing to do would be to bring them home and then have to send them back in to refight battles they've already won because we withdrew too quickly. I would also suggest that you need to have tripwires in your planning between now and September 11th to say, if we have not done things like establish these bases, if we do not have clear plans for how we do address the terrorist threat from over the horizon going forward, if we cannot explain to Congress, let alone to our own troops, how we're going to protect our diplomats and continue to support the Afghan government, then you're going to have to delay this timeline. Mr. Helvey, do you have any comment?
No, thank you. I mean, we are doing planning for each of those areas, and each of the plans, looks at what the different conditions are to how to meet the objective.
I'm sorry, but the gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Hartzler is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a sober hearing. It's a sober moment in our nation's history as we look at the situation in Afghanistan. And I wanted to reiterate what my colleague from Colorado said, that we want to applaud and commemorate and thank all of our service members who have fought over these past 20 years on behalf of freedom, on behalf of us after what happened in September 11th that originated from Afghanistan, and their sacrifice has not been in vain. We are thankful that we have not had another attack on our homeland like we saw on the horrific September 11th because of their bravery, because of their courage, and because of their dedication to this cause of freedom. And I just wanted to recognize and thank everyone who has been fighting and who's continued to fight in their service and sacrifice. Yet at the same time, we're at this moment, and I'm concerned about what happens afterwards. And certainly wanted to start with the situation with the women, Afghanistan women. I had a chance to go to Afghanistan, as many of you know, and several of us have, and met with women in Parliament who are having the opportunity to contribute to a new country that is able to taste and feel that opportunity for freedom. And they said to me, Representative, please don't leave. If the Americans leave, I'm on a hit list with the Taliban. I will be dead within 10 days. And I'm very concerned about that. I got to visit a school where Afghani little girls had an opportunity to have education for the first time. And the spark of hope in their eyes was inspiring. So I want to ask Mr. Helvey and Brigadier General Trollinger, what does the future of Afghan women look like without U.S. troops? And how will women be protected in Afghanistan?
Ma'am, thank you for your question, and thank you as well for your statement of appreciation for all the service in Afghanistan for these past 20 years. With respect to what happens, fundamentally, this is a question that the Afghan people themselves need to be able to answer and solve. We also want to see the gains preserved over the past 20 years. I've been in meetings much like what you've had and heard the same comments. We have an obligation to assist and to help, and we need to do that. We also need to encourage the Afghan government and the Taliban and all the parties, quite frankly, to be able to sit and establish a peace agreement that the Afghan people can support. And that's what our focus is. But that's not something. I mean, we're there. We went there to address the terrorist threat that you talked about.
Sure.
Bring those that attacked us on 9/11 to justice, and we've been able to accomplish that. The President made a determination that the best way to protect American interests in Afghanistan, but also our interests in terms of protecting the homeland, does not require a persistent military presence there. But the United States is not abandoning Afghanistan. We want to maintain a diplomatic presence there. Maintain an embassy there, and the Department of Defense will continue doing what we can do, through an embassy presence to be able to support our partners, and as I've indicated, address the terrorist threats that if and as they emerge.
So from earlier answers to other questions, you have said that there will be the State Department embassy there, and there will be a military force left there in order that's adequate to protect it, to protect our diplomats. You said that you've got a plan to divest the equipment, figure out how much of the equipment is coming home, how much is going to be given to Afghan security forces, how much is just going to be destroyed. I'm going to be very interested in that plan and seeing it. But in your testimony, you also say that a lot of the money that we are going to continue to send to the Special Mission Wing, the Afghan Air Force, Afghan security force is going to be overseen and executed by a DOD contract. So I know we only got a few seconds. How many DOD contractors, Americans, are we still going to have on the ground to oversee these other missions?
We still have planning underway for what that diplomatic presence will look like, but we will try to do as much of that over the horizon as as possible.
And that we'll have to do for now. Gentlelady's time has expired. You might want to get us that answer because I think people are very interested in contracts. So you could get it back to the committee for the record. That would be helpful. Mr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this very important hearing. So when the president announced to the country that we are withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, he said, and I'm going to quote, says, "We were attacked, we went to war with clear goals, we achieved those objectives. Bin Laden is dead and Al-Qaeda is degraded in Afghanistan, and it's time to end the forever war." And Mr. Helvey, you just, in response to the last question, stated and certainly suggested that we've accomplished the goal of preventing terrorist attacks against the United States emanating from Afghanistan. We hear a lot about the over-the-horizon response or capability with no detail. I could contemplate cruise missiles. I could contemplate the introduction of special forces, conventional forces. As the chairman mentioned, there's no miracle solution or option in any one of those over-the-horizon operations. Could certainly lead to loss of further life of further, U.S. Service members. So my question is, what implications does this decision have in terms of the 2001 AUMF as it pertains to Afghanistan? It seems like the purposes of the AUMF have been accomplished as it pertains to Afghanistan. That's why we're pulling out. That was the rationale. That's what you just commented. And it would seem to me then, if they were over the horizon operations, that the administration would need to, under most circumstances, come back to Congress seeking authorization unless any one of the exemptions applied. Could you comment about this decision and the implications for the 2001 AUMF?
I may have to get that back in a written statement, but I don't believe there are direct implications of this decision and the 2001 authorization of use of military forces. But I will endeavor to provide a response in written form after this hearing.
And I appreciate that, and because when I hear over the horizon capability, I know it's not a forever war in terms of having boots on the ground, but the notion that any one of us could wake up tomorrow and know that we've reintroduced U.S. forces after almost a declaration from the president that we've accomplished our goals, we don't anticipate at this point future terrorist attacks against the United States from Afghanistan. I would think that if they were to arise, if they were to emerge, that would be the classic case of coming to Congress and asking for authorization, absent some, self-defense rationale. But I appreciate if you could take that for the record and provide a more detailed, elaborate, and comprehensive response. And with that, please, whether or not the administration intends to use its authority under 10 U.S.C. 127E, which is support, of course, the Afghan government in pursuit of terrorism when special operators would otherwise be authorized to be engaged. So if you could also include that in your response, I would appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Scott is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to just follow up on what my friend and colleague, Mr. Brown, mentioned. It was a 2001 AUMF. It's now 2021. And I do think that while this isn't for these gentlemen, we as Congress have got to have a broader discussion on AUMFs and the War Powers Act. And while some of that will not occur in this committee, I do think that when we agree to send America's men and women into a conflict, that we need to have a public debate and a public vote and an explanation for the United States citizens of why we're doing what we're doing, and that we should not be operating under a legal authority that was granted over 2 decades ago when many of the people that are going over there were not even born yet. I have one other question. This would go for the staff. I would like to know what the budgetary cost and monetary figures, obviously, is of a special immigrant visa, and I would like to know how that cost is calculated, and I would like for us to find a solution sooner rather than later to make sure that we're able to get those special immigrant visas issued for the people that have helped our U.S. troops and our U.S. mission in Afghanistan. With that, you mentioned that one of the key aspects of how we were going to do things, Mr. Helvey, was persistent intelligence. You may not be able to answer that in this forum, but I do not understand how we have persistent intelligence if we only have a diplomatic mission with very limited military support there, only enough to provide security, and we do not have the authority at this stage to base in any of the surrounding areas. Can you explain your definition of persistent intelligence and how we intend to accomplish that?
Sir, thank you for that question. I do think that would be something that would be better left to the closed the closed session.
I'll accept that. The Wall Street Journal last week stated that our European allies are pushing the U.S. to delay its withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm extremely concerned about delaying it and the consequences of a delay. But the article claims that Turkey, which has secured the airport in Kabul for years, has told the U.S. and NATO that its troops may leave as well. And there's speculation that this will cause other Western countries to close their embassies and reduce diplomatic contingents. Is there a coordinated effort between our partners at the diplomatic level of how we're going to provide security together, or is this something that every country is undertaking on its own? And what would the implications for somebody like a Turkey pulling out and no longer providing security at that airport have for the diplomatic missions?
Sir, we are having pretty active consultations and coordination with our allies and our partners. That is something the State Department is leading. The Department of Defense is certainly in support of that. But we are talking about what a future diplomatic presence would be and how we may be able to either singly or collectively be able to provide for security for that diplomatic presence.
Do you believe that the Wall Street Journal article is accurate? Is Turkey considering withdrawing their security forces from securing the airport?
I have to admit I did not read the Wall Street Journal article, but I would say that we're in consultations with Turkey about what their intentions are.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield the remainder of my time. You were not here when I asked the question about the individual cost from a budgetary standpoint about special immigrant visa and how it is calculated, but that's something that I would be interested in seeing, and I think that there would be broad support for finding a way to fund special immigrant visas, but interested in what they cost in the budget and how that's calculated. With that, I yield.
That. Thank you. And I know we have bipartisan support for trying to find a solution here, and we will work to find that solution. Mr. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate that. Mr. Helvey, I wanted to follow up on something I heard you mention in response to a previous question. You had mentioned that we would be providing continued training support during the withdrawal and after the withdrawal. And I guess I just wanted a clarification. After the withdrawal, what would the training support look like to the Afghan forces? Was that something you're envisioning in country? Is that uniform? Is that contractors? I'm just trying to get a little bit more of a sense of what that training support looks like.
We obviously are, I'm sorry, I won't say obviously. We are, thank you for that question. We are still doing, planning on how we would be able to provide, the type of support that's necessary, from an over-the-horizon posture. And I don't want to get into the specific details, here. I could talk a little bit more in a closed session about what some of those options are. But that support can be provided through any a number of ways. Some of that can be done via teleconferences. and other types of connections, something that we've all kind of learned about, unfortunately, during this pandemic.
One thing we had done in Iraq after the withdrawal there initially was an Office of Security Cooperation that was kind of under diplomatic presence, but still allowed for some trainers to be there. Is that something that's on the table? Is that something that's being actively considered?
As indicated, we are still looking at what the options for a diplomatic presence would be, but as you've highlighted, there are cases, Iraq being one, where we've been able to do that type of stuff through a security cooperation office that's based out of an embassy. So we are looking at the different models that we can employ and how to be able to accomplish that. What would be done through a security assistance office? What could be done over the horizon? Those are things that we're working on.
So in a previous conversation you and I had, I had mentioned to you questions about overflight privileges within Afghanistan. I know we've talked about it in terms of the complexities in terms of a potential regional platform, but I just want to clarify, I believe, if I remember correctly, you had mentioned to me that we still would have, after a withdrawal, agreement to be able to have overflight privileges for ISR and other capabilities in Afghanistan. Is that correct? And if so, what was the agreement that you said was still active such that would be allowed?
We do retain the bilateral security agreement that we have with the government of the Islamic Republic of
And that's the
Afghanistan.
2014 Security and Defense Cooperation Agreement that you're referring to?
Yes, sir, the BSA. I mean,
Has there been any discussion at all with the Afghans, or are we hearing at all from the Taliban or others that they are seeking to end that agreement with the withdrawal of our forces, or has that not been raised at all in any context? Like, should we be concerned that that agreement can be terminated? I'm looking here, they've been terminated unilaterally upon notice from one side. So I'm just wondering, is that a concern that we have?
I think we will continue having our conversations with the Afghan government, but to the extent that I'm aware, the intention by both parties, the United States and the government in Kabul, would be to retain that security agreement going forward. I can't speak to what conversations have been had with the Taliban. We're not talking to the Taliban about that because the government of Afghanistan sits in Kabul.
Okay. Well, look, from our standpoint, we have no, at this point, interest or activity to try to renegotiate that. Our posture is to just try to allow that agreement to continue. Is that correct?
That's my understanding. Yes, sir.
Yeah. I guess a question then is, if this is a very widespread, and I certainly want to make sure we maintain overflight privileges. I think ISR and those capabilities are incredibly important to countering a potential terrorist threat. But I'm looking through this document. It's very far-reaching in terms of what is still going to be allowable then in terms of our bilateral agreement. So I guess a question, I'm just trying to understand the left and right limits of what the Defense Department understands that they are capable of doing still. Does the agreement being active mean that we would also consider potential U.S. Special Forces raids on the ground in Afghanistan as something that is still allowable under the president's decision? I'm trying to understand if that is still something that you think is allowable given that this agreement still exists.
I wouldn't want to speculate on that, and nor would I want to get into any hypothetical options we may want to.
But the president has not explicitly said that his decision excludes the potential for U.S. Special Forces raids on the ground in Afghanistan after September 11th this year.
No.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Before I recognize Mr. Gates, my plan is to stop at 1:15, give people a little bit of a break before we then reconvene at 2 for the classified portion of this briefing. With that, Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. I am a frequent and fervent critic of the Biden administration on most things. But when it comes to President Biden's approach to Afghanistan, I want to offer sincere, uncouched praise. I am glad that President Biden wants to end the war in Afghanistan. And let me be clear, I have no confidence in the functional capability of the Afghan government because they are deeply corrupt. I have no confidence in the Taliban because they lie and kill. I also have no confidence that extended U.S. troop deployments to Afghanistan will solve the core problem in Afghanistan, which is that their government is corrupt. They have not endeared themselves to their constituency, and there's not really an appetite to rid the country of the Taliban. In that light, I want to make sure that in these hearings and in our follow-on discussions that we support President Biden in his endeavor to be withdrawn by September 11th. I saw a statement recently from CENTCOM that said that about 12% of the work had been completed to achieve President Biden's objective. And I wanted to ask you, sir, what is your level of confidence that we will, in fact, meet the benchmark wisely set by President Biden?
We do have planning that's underway that is intended to enable a safe, orderly, and coordinated withdrawal along the timeline that the President gave us.
Is the 12% number correct by your assessment?
I don't want to provide a specific number because that percentage may or may not fluctuate on any given day. I understand that United States Central Command is committed to providing, an update, I think, on a weekly basis. I mean, that probably is going to be different today than it was last time that number was offered.
And General Challenger, when we reduced our presence in Iraq, we engaged in this process wherein a lot of military infrastructure paid for by the U.S. taxpayer was given to the Iraqi government. Subsequently, we saw many of those same tanks spray painted black under the control of ISIS in the battle, deep in the fight. What are the lessons that we've learned from Iraq, and how can we ensure that as we complete President Biden's wise withdrawal from Afghanistan, that U.S. military infrastructure and equipment does not fall into the hands of the Taliban or other extremists in Afghanistan?
I think as we conduct our orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan, we're taking a hard look at the things that we can transfer to the government of Afghanistan and to the ANDSF that they can use to provide security to the country. I think in terms of infrastructure, we can pass that off to them. They're able to fall in on that. They're able to use the myriad other equipment and supplies that we're able to hand off to them in a manner such that it will enable them to take the fight to the Taliban if and when they need to.
And you can understand my concern is that the Afghanistan government might be the Taliban at some period of time subsequent to our withdrawal, because I don't have confidence that the Afghan government will prevail over the Taliban following our withdrawal. And that is not a reason to stay. I believe it is just a reality. And so your answer drilled down into the usefulness of U.S. military equipment to the Afghanistan government. But what are the factors of the analysis when it comes to the likelihood that that equipment could fall in the hands of the Taliban or other extremists?
I'm not going to speak to hypotheticals. I think there's a range of possibilities.
No, it's not a hypothetical. Tell me about the decision tree when you look at a piece of equipment. You've said the principal analysis is whether the Afghan government will deem it useful. I guess I only have a few seconds left, but is there a secondary analysis that will be done, not a hypothetical, but a contemporary analysis regarding the risk that that equipment could be in the hands of extremists?
I think the analysis in terms of the risk is taken at the outset before the decision is made of what to transfer to the ANDSF, to the government, and what to retrograde and destroy.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that. I think Ms. Hartzler made a point about it. And so, Mr. Chairman, I want to echo your call for the committee to have the contracts regarding our withdrawal and regarding specifically what will happen to the equipment. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Houlihan is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everybody, all of the witnesses here. I want to start by associating myself with about a half a dozen people who asked, I think, really important questions about safety and security of women and girls in Afghanistan.
Hey, Chris, your mic, I don't know where your mic is at, but we're not picking you. We hear you, but...
Of course. Let me see if is that better, sir?
That is a whole lot better. Yes, thank you.
Excellent.
So I'll start over again. I just want to associate myself with the remarks of the half a dozen members of our committee that were concerned appropriately with the safety of women and girls in Afghanistan. Continue to be concerned about that, but I feel as though that's been covered. And so my question is for Mr. Helvey. Chairman Milley has said that the U.S. will continue to provide financial support to the Afghan security forces. And I know that Mr. Courtney, Representative Courtney, was asking about this as well. What does that look like? If you could kind of elaborate more on that, what exactly are we or would we be funding? And how does that cost kind of compare to what it was or is when our troops are in Afghanistan?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think there are three basic classes of activities that we would want to continue, supporting and funding through the Afghan Security Forces Fund. The first is to be able to maintain payment of salaries of the Afghan security forces. The second is to continue providing certain types of supplies and equipment to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, and the third is to enable continued operations and function of the Afghan Air Force and Afghan Special Mission Wing. So those are the three basic classes of activities that we'd look to be able to continue through the ASIF resources. And as I indicated, we are looking at what those options are, doing the detailed and prudent planning to be able to provide for that through, whether it's over the horizon means or distant means that relies on, much less of a large footprint in Afghanistan, one that, could include perhaps something that's done in tandem with the Security Cooperation Office in the embassy. One of the things that is going to be critical as we look at this is the conversations that we have up here and that we have with our congressional oversight to ensure that we're providing the right type of oversight and management controls of those resources to ensure that we remain in full compliance with the law. But certainly, those are the three areas that we see as being important to continue.
And how do you, if you can, anticipate what the relevant costs will be in comparison to when troops were or currently are in Afghanistan? Is it a one-to-one correspondence? Is it cheaper, or what do you anticipate if you can?
I think we're looking at resourcing through the 22 budget submission. I don't want to kind of get ahead of that. I mean, obviously, if there are ways that we can realize cost savings as we do it, we will. But in terms of salary, the salaries, for example, would not diminish with a smaller U.S. Military presence. Similar with some of the supplies and support for maintenance for the Air Force. So I don't want to kind of get ahead of a budget process in terms of what the number looks like, but I would say that we'll require substantial resources to continue to be able to accomplish those three aspects of the ASIF profile, for lack of a better term, going forward.
And with what remains of my time, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on our relationship with our NATO allies, as they are also making decisions about whether or not to withdraw. Do you think that this will affect our relationship with our NATO allies, our decision to withdraw from Afghanistan?
Well, this is a decision that we undertook together with NATO. In fact, on April 14th, Secretary Austin was at NATO, and we've engaged in conversations and consultations with our NATO partners through this process. And as I indicated in response to a previous question, we came into Afghanistan with NATO. We came in together. We've adjusted our presence together, and we will leave together. This is an important commitment that we have. Just as our NATO allies stood by us in our time of need, we will do this together, and those consultations are absolutely critical. They're ongoing, and they'll continue to go on.
Thank you, sir. And with my last 15 seconds, do you anticipate that our soldiers will be redeployed or will be coming back to CONUS? What do you anticipate to be where they're headed next?
I think I'd have to leave that to the closed session because I'm not entirely sure where they will all go. Some
All
will
right,
come home,
we'll take
some
that in the
will go-
closed session. Gentlelady's time has expired. Mr. Waltz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to comment on some of your earlier remarks, and I think you're absolutely right about our accountability to our constituents in terms of future casualties. I think it's important to recognize that before 2020, before we entered the agreement, we lost 17 soldiers in Afghanistan due to combat deaths. The Army alone lost 20 in training accidents. Much less the losses of the Navy with the collisions and other types of accidents. So I think we need to continue to take a hard look at what our measure of success here, if it is avoiding casualties or if it's protecting the homeland. I don't think anyone's suggesting that we stop training or stop operations because we're sustaining casualties along those lines. But I do think we also are going to be accountable to our constituents. I think we're going to be accountable the next time we have an attack like Pulse nightclub or San Bernardino, the truck attacks in New York. And to Mr. Moulton's point, we're going to be accountable if we lose additional soldiers fighting our way back in, if the intelligence community is correct that Al-Qaeda fully intends to resurge in the wake of a Taliban resurgence. Mr. Helvey, and for the committee, I want to be on the record here. We have, and I'm glad you agree, that we have a moral obligation, as you stated in your testimony, to take care of those who have stood with us in extremism. We need to get those people out, and I want you to hear that from me loud and clear. Mr. Crow told his story. All of us who have served there have them. One of my interpreters was executed along with members of his family simply for having documentation that he needed to get the SIV visa. So we need to evacuate them out. This processing, this 14-step process that the State Department has, I agree you need to set up a task force and address this bureaucratic issue. But all of that can be done if we get these folks, these interpreters, civil society leaders, politicians, school teachers that have stood with us, if we get them to Doha, Al Udeid, to other bases. Is there anything preventing you from evacuating these individuals, and then we can deal with the appropriate vetting, processing, Congress's authorization? What's preventing you from doing that?
I think, I think that the focus that we have is on, supporting a peaceful outcome in Afghanistan. We are continuing to work with our Afghan partners, and our Afghan partners are continuing to work.
Mr. Helvey, I'm sorry, I appreciate that, but I can tell you these folks, these people who have stood with us are being hunted down as we speak. They are being executed. Their families' lives are on the line. And I believe that when that last soldier goes wheels up, we have essentially handed them a death sentence. So we have between now and when those last C-17 flights leave Bagram Air Base to get these folks out. General Milley has said he expects 1,000 C-17 flights, much of it with equipment. Where would you prioritize these people that stood with us versus some equipment? I would hope that you would prioritize these people more so. It's not just a moral issue, it's a national security issue for the message that we're sending. And if we do have to go back in, who's going to stand with us again?
We are working with our interagency partners to look at the different tools and the resources and the mechanisms to support those folks that have supported us.
Thank you, Mr. Helvey. No, thank you. I mean, I want to be clear. We need an evacuation plan, and time is of the essence. The other piece here, you mentioned in your testimony, and I think you agree, that Afghan national security forces are critical to the future, the critical future of Afghan security, and therefore the homeland security. President Ghani said in 2019 he anticipates his security forces can hold 6 months without full U.S. support, including financial support. I have real questions of whether this committee and this Congress will continue to appropriate billions of dollars with a power sharing agreement with the Taliban, number one, and then number two, without appropriate oversight of those dollars. And since we will have no one left but those in the embassy, how do you plan, and in the interest of time, please submit for the record how you plan to oversee those dollars. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman, and to our panelists today. I want to thank you all for this important conversation. I think it's clear and that there is wide bipartisan support for helping our partners and ensuring that they have access to what they need to be evacuated, and so that we can keep our promises. There's also wide bipartisan support on ensuring that we protect women and girls in Afghanistan. And so I hope that those two opportunities that we have to act swiftly and urgently, that we do everything possible to ensure that we do keep those promises. Gentlemen, the United States has at its disposal a host of tools and resources available for addressing legitimate security concerns, including those posed by violent extremist groups. With the withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan, can you share with us some of the non-militarized initiatives and tools DoD will be using to continue advancing our interests and peace and security in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you for that question. We'll obviously be working, closely with our interagency, colleagues and counterparts to be able to work with our Afghan partners. There are things that the Department of Defense has and things that the Department of Defense does, that can help to support security. We've talked about some of that in terms of continuing to provide resources to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. I think that's a critical component to ensure that we've got a willing and capable partner there. But also there's other tools and resources that the U.S., like the U.S. Agency for International Development would have, State Department would have, our other interagency partners. And we will play the role that the Department of Defense has played historically, which is being a supporting element, working very closely with those agencies and departments in what they're doing in terms of advice or assistance or other development projects. A lot of this is going to hinge on the security environment in Afghanistan. A lot of this is going to hinge on our partnership with the government in Kabul. But I would prefer to let those departments and agencies kind of speak to the tools and resources and mechanisms that they have.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Since the U.S.-Taliban deal was initially signed in February 2020, the Taliban has escalated its attacks on Afghan forces, and civilian deaths have spiked, with women being the primary targets. And we've heard colleagues on both sides of the aisle express concern about that. Has the department made any special demands that extend protections for women during any of these and any other ongoing peace negotiations and communications?
Obviously, the safety and security of all Afghans, but in particular Afghan women and children, is an important consideration for us. I would have to defer to State Department and Ambassador Khalilzad specifically to talk about what specific demands or conversations he's had with the Taliban as State Department and Ambassador Khalilzad has been doing those negotiations.
Okay. Thank you. When we previously withdrawn or reduced U.S. military presence from countries, for example, in Iraq. And one of my colleagues mentioned that our withdrawals have contributed to political instability. And since the U.S. withdrawal, Iraq has faced an unsettling rise in civil unrest, and it's experiencing political power struggles. How do we ensure that our withdrawal leaves a better legacy with security and stability? And I know there's only 30 seconds left, so if you wouldn't mind, just very quickly.
Yeah, I think a key, and I'll just come back to this because I've indicated in a couple of responses that the key really is supporting the Afghan government and the Afghan people themselves in helping to establish a durable political settlement in Afghanistan. That is the way to best achieve those outcomes. And we are withdrawing our forces. We're committed to doing it in a safe, orderly, and coordinated way. But fundamentally, it's going to be the Afghan people themselves that determine their future.
Thank you. The gentlewoman's time has expired. Ms. Bice is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. As it's been discussed previously, our nation has been at war in Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades. Our service members have served bravely and valiantly in this conflict, and it's denied our nation's adversaries the terror safe haven that Afghanistan once was. We are now on the precipice of a full and complete withdrawal. And while I would like to see that happen, I have concerns that the Afghan government may crumble in our absence. A recent example of this similar situation was U.S. forces being withdrawn from Iraq in 2011. Just a few years after our complete withdrawal, Iraqi army nearly crumbled in the face of ISIS, and U.S. forces were deployed back to Iraq and continue to serve to this day. So I offer this as an example of my perspective and highlight we should be thoughtful in this approach. It would be a shame to see the democratic Afghan government fall and the region reemerge as a safe haven for terrorists. My first question to both witnesses: can either of you give me a sense of how much of the landmass of Afghanistan the Taliban currently has operational control over? And are there any areas that are notable strongholds of the Taliban?
I'll ask my Joint Staff colleague to address that.
I think, if you don't mind, I'd like to take that maybe to the closed session.
You got it. Well, let me follow up then. General, in the testimony, you noted that the administration is planning to reposition U.S. counterterrorism forces in the region to be able to respond quickly should the need arise. Afghanistan is geographically isolated and is surrounded by nations that are less friendly to the U.S., as been mentioned earlier. What challenges would our nation face if the need to take action against Afghanistan were to arise following the complete withdrawal?
I'm sorry, which witness did you direct that to?
I'm sorry. General, it was directed to General.
I would ask you to repeat that, please. I didn't hear the question.
Sure. You noted that the administration is planning to reposition U.S. counterterrorism forces in the region to respond quickly should the need arise. But Afghanistan is geographically isolated and surrounded by nations that are less friendly to the United States. What challenges would our nation face if the need to take action against Afghanistan were to arise following the complete withdrawal?
Again, I think we can talk about that a little bit more in detail in our closed session. However, clearly, we'll face greater challenges than we currently do with the forces that we have on the ground in Afghanistan currently.
Thank you for that. And how feasible would it be for the U.S. to rapidly take decisive action in Afghanistan following our complete withdrawal?
I think it's feasible that they react very quickly if the situation warrants.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lauria is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for testifying today. I want to reiterate some concerns that my colleagues have spoken of previously during the hearing about our withdrawal and the situation that will result from a rapid withdrawal and the potential threats to our homeland. And next, I wanted to pivot to perhaps the picture that hangs behind me on the wall here in my office. Immediately following the announcement of the timeline for withdrawal by September 11th, one of the first questions that was asked in the open source media and the press is, where's the aircraft carrier? Which is frequently the question anywhere in the world. And I wonder if you could comment on the longevity, your plans on how long you think it will be necessary to maintain an aircraft carrier presence in the AOR and in support of the withdrawal or even post-withdrawal for a presence in the region. And then Mr. Helvey, if you could also comment, as I understand you cover the whole Indo-Pacific, on what impact keeping a continuous carrier presence in the Gulf will have on the needs that we have in other areas of the world, specifically countering Chinese activity in the Western Pacific and South China Sea.
With regard to your question about the added capability in the region to support our withdrawal, I think that will be considered iteratively, such that once the conditions are such that it's not a requirement, then it would be able to leave the theater.
So can you explain the iterative to me? Like, when is it not a requirement? What else are we going to have in theater? It's been referenced multiple times by my colleagues that air bases, land-based positions from which to operate within the region are limited as our overflight considerations. So, what are those criteria you're looking for that would make you say that, yes, we could withdraw the carrier ultimately?
Well, looking forward, it won't consider hypotheticals, but again, I think there's a range of circumstances, a range of options that could be considered, and all those would go into the decision-making that would determine what resources remain in theater and what wouldn't.
So, General, multiple times today, you and your colleague have said that you wouldn't consider hypotheticals, but is considering hypotheticals not the planning process? Don't we have COAs, courses of action, different things that could result from different things that we can't control, i.e., the other parties involved in this and how they will react? We have different courses of action. So, are those hypotheticals, or are you saying we don't have plans for those things? It's a little unclear.
I would say we absolutely considered all these variables in coming up with plans, and I would call them contingency plans for a certain set of potential outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, General. Mr. Helvey, can you comment on the impact on carrier presence within the whole Indo-PACOM area based off having a carrier dedicated to supporting the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, thank you for that question. And yeah, in terms of hypotheticals, I think, there's a hypothetical issue, and then there's also, not getting ahead of decisions that haven't been made by the Secretary in terms of how to allocate certain forces. In terms of, implications for, aircraft carrier presence, we do have more than one. And clearly, I think, we need to be able to have a global force that's arrayed to be able to accomplish the global missions and requirements that are levied against the department. And part of the iterative process that General Trollinger was talking about is reviewing what those requirements are, reviewing the needs of the different combatant commands, evaluating those requirements, and then presenting.
I'm sorry to interrupt there, but our time is limited on this topic. And what I would say is, yes, I'm aware that we have more than one. We have 11. And we struggle to even maintain, a 2.0 presence globally. And, according to both the outgoing and incoming U.S. Indo-PACOM commanders, now Admiral Aquilino, they need more carrier presence in the Western Pacific and the South China Sea and the area to contend with China's actions. So, since this is your area, are you satisfied with the amount of presence that we've had? And are you concerned at all with the additional demand that's being drawn on the carrier force due to this support of the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
I'm satisfied with the decisions that the Secretary has made and how to allocate the forces. Look, if you think about what we need to be able to do to be able to maintain our presence in the Indo-Pacific, yes, having an additional maritime presence, whether it's through aircraft carriers or through other surface combatants, that is important. That presence matters. It allows us to maintain deterrence of aggression and assurance of our allies and our partners, and to make sure that we maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. So those decisions have to be made through.
I apologize, your lady's time has expired. As it stands right now, we are unlikely to get to everybody who's still here by 1:15. So if we could, do our best to move as quickly as possible and get to as many people as we can. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes, and then Mr. Golden will be after Mr. Bacon, and then we're pretty close to time, depending on how this goes. Mr. Bacon, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate you having this hearing. Thank you both for being here today. I did want to make a comment about something that Mr. Chairman said earlier, that we have bipartisan support for this withdrawal based on current administration and the previous administration. I want to point out, too, we've had bipartisan deep concerns as well. Even 2 years ago, I was concerned about the SIVs, trying to get them back home, because no doubt when the Taliban, wherever they're at, if they take over the country, they're going to hunt and kill these interpreters and their families. We have a moral obligation to have a plan there. I also had concerns in the previous administration that we were negotiating with the Taliban without the Afghan government there. I thought that was a disgrace to treat our allies in that way. So there's been bipartisan concerns. We've heard it today as well. I want to commend Mr. Rogers, too, for his comments last month on the Afghanistan withdrawal. Having a hasty undertaking is a mistake that will not be in the interest of our national security. It may seem politically advantageous to get a deal done. The reality is that the Taliban's recent violence shows that they perceive this as a full-fledged capitulation. As I stated before, I've always been skeptical about a hasty withdrawal based on a calendar and not on a conditions-based philosophy. A lot of folks don't realize we only have 2,500 troops there. A lot of folks back home think we still have like 100,000. We have 2.5% of that. And I found that this was an affordable way to help keep the government in power, to suppress the Taliban, working with the Afghan government. What I'm concerned is we pull these forces out, the cost of returning, if Al-Qaeda get a safe haven under the Taliban again, will be much higher in blood and treasure. And so I think this puts us at risk in the long run. So my first question, in 2011, we withdrew from Iraq, and then ISIS filled that void. Is there a risk that this could happen here in Afghanistan as well, Mr. Helving?
There is a risk that if we withdraw, or when we withdraw, that international terrorist groups like ISIS could emerge and strengthen in Afghanistan. And part of our planning is to try to reduce and mitigate that risk and reduce the threat to the homeland that those groups may pose to us.
You know, the thought is we have a small presence. It's cheaper in the long run than have to do what we did in Iraq following the 2011 withdrawal. And so that's my primary concern. And it sounds to me like we have your commitment to advocate for a interagency lead for the SIVs.
Yes, I mean an interagency process with a designated lead.
It seems to me we have a big obligation to ensure we get this right. And it sounds to me like we have your commitment to ensure that we have an airborne ISR capability over Afghanistan when this is all done.
I did not commit future military forces, but I indicated that we intend to continue the bilateral security agreement that we have with the government of Afghanistan and continue to work with our Afghan partners to be able to provide the type of ISR that we think will be necessary to monitor and assess terrorist threats.
If we withdraw and don't have airborne ISR capability over Afghanistan, I think it's a failure. We're setting ourselves up for a failure. So I hope it's got to be a requirement in my view. And finally, I just want to ask, are we confident the Taliban have broken their alliance with Al-Qaeda?
Can I address that in the closed session?
Okay. Sure, if you think it's classified, we'll do so. That's the concern. If these folks come in a year, 2 years, 3 years, and we get a safe haven for Al-Qaeda again, we'll be back to a 9/11 scenario. So with that, I appreciate both of you. Thanks for being here. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I appreciate that. And Mr. Bacon, part of the reason that we've been able to have the 2,500 troops there is because we had a ceasefire with the Taliban. Okay, and that ceasefire expired on May 1st. So I think when we're trying to calculate, yes, if we could cut a deal with the Taliban to have an ongoing ceasefire where they wouldn't attack us, that changes the equation. But that's a piece that, as we're trying to figure out what the right decision here is, I hope we have adequate respect for that. Absent that ceasefire, it changes the equation, and I don't think 2,500 troops would cut it if they were attacking us, and that's part of what we're trying to balance. So, but you're right on the visas, and And I don't, from this hearing, it doesn't sound like we have a sufficient plan to protect those people. I would urge, and sorry, I got to get to someone else, so just for the record, the DOD needs to do some work on whether it's a temporary protective status, whether it's upping the visas. It has to be a higher priority in these next 4 or 5 months as we head to September. And with that, Mr. Golden is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You hear me all right?
Yes, we got you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Just one thing, I would urge you to speak up because it's a little quieter than normal. So just make sure you're enunciating clearly, but we do hear you.
Certainly, and if you're having a hard time, just don't hesitate to interrupt. I don't have too many questions. A lot of what I've heard has already answered many of the questions I came with today, but I did want to just comment that listening to the conversation has at times been a little frustrating and must be disheartening for some of our allies. At times it has seemed that many of our colleagues have predetermined the outcome of Afghanistan's future. Just listening in, it sounds like some people have already reached the conclusion that the Taliban will achieve some kind of sure military victory on the battlefield. I wanted to give the opportunity to General Challenger perhaps to speak to what he believes the current situation is. What are the capabilities of the Afghan military and Afghan government to hold its own on the battlefield? I know you can't speak with any certainty. There's no such thing as a guarantee on the battlefield, but if properly resourced, equipped, and supported by the United States, even without troops on the ground, do you believe that the Afghan military can perform and prevail?
Yes, I do believe that the Afghan military can perform. They're a capable fighting force. They have sound ground forces, air forces, special operations forces. They're a capable military force.
Thank you for that. And I don't know if this question is best for the general or perhaps for the assistant secretary, but I know that the secretary commented that we believe the best way, the administration believes the best way to preserve the gains that have been made over the past 20 years would be to help support the achievement of a peace settlement. But in the absence of such an agreement, is it the position of the administration to stand by the Afghan government?
Yes, and we do intend to stand by the Afghan government. And, one of the things that we've talked about this morning is, continuing to provide support and assistance to the Afghan forces that are partnering with us, but also, fighting to, preserve stability and bring about peace in their country.
I know you're not unlikely to speak to any number, but in the president's budget request, then the administration is going to request the funding necessary that it believes is necessary to support the Afghan government on the battlefield years ahead.
I don't want to get ahead of the budget submission, but yes, we would envision putting in continued funding for the ASIF program in particular, and we would certainly request support from the Congress for that.
Thank you very much. That's really all I was looking for. I guess just in closing, Mr. Chair, I would say one of the lessons of 9/11 to me was some of the hesitancy of previous administrations many years ago to strike terrorist organizations anywhere in the world in order to protect our national security. I think we've learned that lesson, and I think we've advanced our technologies significantly since the late 1990s, early 2000s. I have great faith in the capabilities of the United States military to defend this country and to bring the fight to our enemies without being engaged indefinitely on the ground in countries around the world, such as in Afghanistan or Iraq. I don't doubt the commitment of the Biden administration to protecting the country from the terrorist threat, and I would hope that they are as committed as all previous administrations have been to taking the steps necessary and striking when we need to protect this country from the terrorist threat. I know the last administration administration did it with Soleimani. I believe that we preserve the capability going forward. So I just want to thank the general, thank our troops serving around the world, and look forward to working with this committee to make sure that we can continue to support the mission in Afghanistan with or without troops on the ground.
Thank you very much. Just to really emphasize the one point that's come up throughout this hearing is I think there is considerable concern about partners in Afghanistan, particularly interpreters and people who have worked directly with us who want to get out. If the number is 18,000, that's a number that we ought to be able to find a way to accommodate. And as I've said a couple of times now, I think it's really important, certainly that the Department of Defense, but the State Department, the whole of government really sort of moves that up on the priority list to go forward, to try and find a way to help the people who have helped us. Now, I will point out, and it's important, that before we showed up, the Taliban were running roughshod over the country and killing a whole lot of people before we even got there. So to the extent that people are planting the idea that somehow our presence created this problem, I don't think that's accurate. As we saw the history of the Taliban throughout the 90s, leading up to when we went in 2001. And I think the record is clear. We have tried to help the Afghan people. But there are limits on what we can accomplish, and I hope we'll understand and respect that effort and the men and women who gave their lives and were otherwise, significantly impacted by that effort, and that we respect and honor that effort going forward. With that, Mr. Rogers, do you have anything for the good of the order?
Yeah, and I completely agree with everything the chairman just said. Also, it kind of leads me into how I want to wrap this up before we go into classified hearing. What we've heard today is when it comes to basing, when it comes to the visas for these people who have helped us, when it comes to training the Afghan forces going forward, we're working on it. I'm of the opinion this should have been resolved before you announced you were leaving. I'm hoping that when we get in the classified setting, we're going to get more clarity. That gives me comfort that we're working on it. It means a whole lot more than we're working on it. But before we consummate this withdrawal, we need to have it worked out and have these things resolved, because these are all very important things that we need to know before we get completely out of there. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I look forward to the classified briefing.
Completely agree. With that, we're adjourned, and we'll see you in about 45 minutes.